Welcome to Friday, everyone. You know what we're doing today. We are revising and editing and publishing a final draft of one of your poems for the week. Before we start, I have to say, you guys, your writing is so amazing. Every day it seems that your poems, the quality, the words that you use, getting better and better and better. I am really, really impressed with your work. Good job. So, today is all about revising and editing, and I wanted to chat about what exactly does it mean to revise and edit. I'm going to start with what it's not. It is not turning in an exact copy of something that you've written. What it is really thinking about your work and pushing yourself to find ways, even small ways, to make it even better than it already is. And I want you to think about the mentor sentences that we use in grammar. There's always that one day where we're asked to revise that sentence. Now we know that that sentence is pretty awesome. I mean, that's why we're studying it. Plus, it's in a published book, so we know that it's good. It's well written. But whenever I ask you guys to go back and think about ways to make that sentence better, you always rise to the challenge. You find ways, you find synonyms, you replace words with other words that you can think of. You take out pronouns like the word she and you replace it with the actual name of a character from the book. You add things. It's awesome. So that's exactly what we're doing today. In the video that you're going to watch, you are going to see me walk through two forms that you're going to use today to help you as you work. One of them is a copy of the rubric that we're going to be using. That way you know what to aim for. The second form is a checklist of revising things and editing things we want you to keep in mind as you work today. It's also going to be a way for you to share with us what you're thinking as you're revising and editing. Writing is very subjective, so we know that what you think versus what somebody else thinks might be very, very different. So we want to give you the chance to sort of elaborate on why you did what you did or why you left your poem the way that you left it. You're going to see me explain that in my videos. Also, side note, I know that my videos kind of cut off the whole screen. Not quite figured out how to fix that, so I apologize if you can't see everything that I'm talking about. Listen to what I'm saying, and then when you go back and actually look at the form, you're going to see everything there. I actually did some revising and editing today on one of my poems. I chose the snow poem, and you can already see how I have crossed out words. I've added words that I didn't think about before, and overall I added, I think, 4 different new words or changes to my writing. So this is nothing crazy. We're not asking you to take your rough draft and completely get rid of it and start fresh. We're just saying find ways, small ways, that you can make your writing even better. When I went through and I finished and I edited my copy, I made a final draft. And my final draft looks different than my rough draft. It's on a new piece of paper, it's neatly written. All of the changes that I made in my rough draft are now here in my final draft. I've tried to add some illustrations. Snow is a kind of difficult one to add pictures for, but I tried my best. So as you work today, really think about the differences and the changes that you're making between the two copies. Even when you share your writing with us today, if you want to take a picture of your rough draft versus your final draft, awesome. So good luck today. We are super excited to see how you revise and edit your work. You guys are amazing. Have a great Friday and have a great weekend. Bye. This is your rubric for this week's poetry assignment. I want to go through the expectations and talk a little bit about how to exceed expectations. I'm not going to talk too much about the areas for improvement. We really hope that you guys will meet expectations, and I want you to know that if there's areas as you're working where you're just not quite sure if you're meeting expectations, you are more than welcome to send me an email, or you are more than welcome to arrange for a WebEx chat, and we can walk through this. I really would love all of you to be where you are meeting this week's expectations. So structure. The expectations this week are that you use line breaks or stanzas that don't take away from the meaning of your poem. The structure helps to create a rhythm for your poem. We recognize that you guys are trying out line breaks, and some of you are even trying out stanzas. My lesson this week really just focused on line breaks, which is why in the expectations you can choose line breaks or stanzas. However, if you are trying out stanzas and it makes sense for your poem and you want to include both, I almost think that that's probably evidence of exceeding expectations. No matter what you use this week though, we want to make sure that it's purposeful and that it adds to the meaning of your poem and that it sounds like poetry when you use it. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. Here's first version. The flowers sprouted up from the ground and danced in the sunlight. Obviously, this doesn't look like a poem. It doesn't use line breaks or stanzas. Really not what we're going for at all. Here's second version. Listen to where the line breaks are and how it's being read. The flowers sprouted up from the ground and danced in the sunlight. Yes, this poem has line breaks, but does it sound poetic? Does it have a rhythm to it? And when I read this poem, just the way that it was read, I feel like there's like this robotic feel to it. Like it's stop and go, stop and go. Not really what we're aiming for with our poems. Here's the last version. Listen to the way that this is read. The flowers sprouted up from the ground and danced in the sunlight. I'm only reading it the way that it's meant to be read, and the way that it's meant to be read is where the line breaks are. So when I read this poem, those line breaks are purposeful. It creates a rhythm to the poem, and it makes sense, and there's this sound that poetry has to it. And I hope that you could hear the difference between this version versus the last version. I also love how they're played around with the size of the words, up and then ground, kind of smaller, closer to the ground. So this to me meets expectations. The previous one, even though it had line breaks, it lacked a rhythm to it. So a good lesson that even though you have line breaks, it doesn't mean that it's enhancing or adding meaning to your poem. Word choice. Writer uses words that are strong and specific to their topic. I was reading a poem yesterday about baseball, and the writer described setting up. I thought that was fantastic. That is very specific to their topic. There were some other poems that I was reading this week about animals, and the words were very specific to that animal that they were writing about. So really look at your poem. Are you using words that are specific to your topic? Also, are you using several examples of adjectives, vivid verbs, and or figurative language? Several means more than two, but not a ton. So we're looking for that in your writing today. If you use more than just a couple, but it still makes sense and it's not overwhelming, you're probably exceeding expectations. Voice. The writer speaks directly to the reader. The writer uses words that sound like him or her. This one's kind of hard to show us that you have it. Writing is very subjective, so what you think you might have done, somebody else might see differently. So I'm going to show you in our next form how you can almost prove to us that you have this, kind of explain to us where you've shown voice in your writing. Then we go on to conventions. I think this is pretty self-explanatory. There are very few errors in spelling, capitalization, and punctuation. And then appearance. Again, self-explanatory. Your final draft is neatly written or typed, and there was obvious effort put into creating this final piece of poetry. I think for both of those, if you're aiming for exceeding expectations, you might have no errors in spelling, capitalization, punctuation. And as far as appearance goes, you might type it and you might do something extra with it. You might add illustrations to it, and not just kind of a random drawing somewhere, but you really took the time. It's really obvious that you put effort into creating a final piece. The next document that you're going to be using today is your final draft checklist. You've got a place for your first and last name, the title of your poem, and some directions up at the top. I stress again how important it is for you to reread your rough draft, especially before you start revising and editing. The first section is all about revising. Also, side note, please make sure that your writing is right next to you as you're using this form. You should have a pencil in hand, and as you go through this checklist, you should be crossing out and changing things on your rough draft as you're looking at this form. All right, there are 3 columns on this form. One says I already have, I added now, and I chose not to include it. Heads up, this form does allow you to check all 3 boxes, but I do not want you to do that. It doesn't make sense to say that you already have replaced words, you added words, or you chose not to include words. Doesn't make sense. So only one of these boxes should be clicked for each row. Let me give you an example for the first category. By the way, all of these were things that were in our rubric that we just went over. Number 1, replaced overused words with synonyms. If you look at your rough draft and you recognize that you use some of the same words over and over again, and then you go back and you find synonyms for some of those words so that you can change how often you use the same word, great. You added that right now. I know a lot of you are kind of revising as you write your rough draft, and that's fine. So if you used Wednesday's poem and after you wrote it on Wednesday, you went back and recognized that you needed to change up some of your words, perfect. If you already have it, click that. If you decided today that you didn't want to do this, you were fine the way that it was, you're going to click I chose not to include. Let me skip down to the line breaks and stanzas row. Remember that I said you don't have to have both. If you decided that you were just going to focus on line breaks with today's poem, that's fine. If you are not including stanzas, you're just going to click I chose not to include. Below that, we are asking for sort of a narrative, an explanation about what you did today when you revised. This is where you can be very, very specific and tell us what we should look at and just pretty much what you did. Some questions to think about when you get to this section. What did you notice your first draft didn't have that you added in your final draft? And what exactly did you do to make your final draft even better than your rough draft? Remember in my previous segment, I talked about voice and how subjective that is. Here's where you can elaborate on where you think you have voice, but make sure that you're very detailed. Don't just write, I changed it, I added stuff, I made it better. That doesn't tell us exactly what you did to make your writing better. The next section goes on to editing. We're using the same strategy that we used last week with cops. Take them, focus on one at a time. Start with capitalization. As you've got your paper in front of you, go through and look for proper nouns and beginning of sentences. Make sure they're capitalized. As soon as you do have those, go off to column 1, check it. Keep moving on to each one of these as you check your work. Click the box. And again, down here at the bottom, it explains, make sure that you tell us what you did with your final draft. How did you edit it? Questions to think about. What mistakes did you find? How did you correct them? Again, elaborate. Give us detail. What exactly did you do today? And then down at the very bottom are some directions about what you're going to do with your final draft now that you've revised and edited it.